The small, quiet town of New Zealand seemed like the perfect place to live, where the biggest concerns were the weather or what to make for dinner. But beneath this peaceful exterior, a storm was brewing, a storm that would soon engulf an entire community. In the early hours of a seemingly normal morning, Kerryn Tate, a beloved wife and mother, was found dead in her home, her life snatched away in a horrific and brutal manner. The news of Kerryn's murder sent shockwaves through the town. The image of Kerryn, a figure known for her kindness, her strong family values, and her deep involvement in the local church, seemed to stand in stark contrast to the brutality with which her life was taken. Kerryn wasn't just another victim. She was someone everyone knew, and someone whose death didn't make sense. Who would want to harm such a person? What could possibly drive someone to take the life of a loving wife, mother, and community pillar? Her murder was more than just a random act of violence. It was a mystery that sent detectives on a relentless hunt for the truth. Was it someone she knew? Or was this the act of a stranger, someone who had a motive too horrifying to comprehend? The investigation was full of twists and turns, each lead only leading to more confusion. No one in Kerryn's life appeared to have a reason to harm her. Her family had no history of violence, and there were no signs of financial issues or marital problems. As the investigation unfolded, more questions arose than answers. Early leads pointed toward the most obvious suspect, Kerryn's husband, Greg. The couple's friends spoke of minor disagreements and moments of tension, but no one had ever imagined this would escalate to such a tragic event. Greg, however, was adamant that he had nothing to do with his wife's death. With a solid alibi, he was cleared of suspicion, but the doubts lingered. Could someone close to Kerryn have committed this unspeakable act? The investigation soon turned its focus on a series of strange events leading up to Kerryn's death. There were whispers about a secret lover, a confrontation with an old acquaintance, and even the bizarre presence of a mysterious car seen parked near Kerryn's house in the days leading up to the crime. But every lead seemed to end in a dead end. The truth was slipping further away with each passing day. Could there be a hidden motive that no one could see? Or was there something darker at play that no one wanted to admit? What followed was a trail of red herrings, false accusations, and mysterious figures lurking in the shadows of Kerryn's past. The case seemed to be getting colder by the day, as if it was destined to remain unsolved. But just when the investigation appeared to stall, a breakthrough would come. One small, seemingly insignificant clue would unravel everything, revealing the true, chilling reason behind Kerryn Tate's murder. Kerryn Tate's death is not just a crime. It's a haunting mystery that continues to leave unanswered questions. Who killed Kerryn Tate and why? How did such a senseless act of violence come to be in a community that seemed so peaceful and serene? The chilling investigation is one that will make you question the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most perfect lives. Kerryn Tate's life was the kind of life many envied. She was the epitome of a picture-perfect suburban mom, someone who seemed to effortlessly juggle her roles as a wife, mother, and active member of her community. Born and raised in New Zealand, Kerryn's childhood was full of warmth and love. Growing up in a small rural town, she had always felt deeply connected to her surroundings and her family. Her parents, who were both hardworking and nurturing, taught her the values of family, compassion, and community, values that Kerryn would carry throughout her life. She had two younger siblings, with whom she shared a bond that only strengthened as they grew older. From a young age, Kerryn displayed a natural talent for building strong, lasting relationships. She was friendly, outgoing, and always eager to help others. Her school years were filled with achievements, both academically and socially. Teachers admired her work ethic, and classmates loved her easygoing personality. Kerryn's ability to connect with people made her well-liked by everyone she met. But it wasn't just her ability to make friends that set her apart. She had a remarkable sense of empathy. She was the person you could turn to when you needed a listening ear or a comforting word. As Kerryn transitioned into adulthood, she remained rooted in her small-town life. She found a job as a teacher's aide at the local school, where she could work with children and make a real difference in their lives. But it wasn't just her career that Kerryn valued. It was her family life. At the age of 23, she met Greg Tate, a kind-hearted and quiet man with whom she quickly fell in love. They had both grown up in the same area, and their connection felt almost destined. The couple married in 2002 and settled into a cozy home in the suburbs, not far from where Kerryn had grown up. Over the years, they built a life together, raising two children, a son and a daughter. Kerryn's role as a mother was one she took incredibly seriously. She was the kind of mother who showed up at every school event, volunteered for every fundraiser, and made sure her children had the best possible upbringing. She took pride in being the supermom, balancing her family life with the occasional girls' night out and her volunteer work at the local church. The Tate family had a perfect balance, or at least it seemed that way. Kerryn and Greg's home was always filled with laughter, love, and the warm smell of homemade meals. It wasn't just the family unit that Kerryn cherished. She was deeply involved in the wider community, volunteering her time and efforts to help local charities, coordinate fundraising events, and ensure the well-being of others. She wasn't just a mother. She was a community leader, someone who worked tirelessly to make her town a better place for everyone. Her love for the church and her unwavering faith played a significant role in shaping her life. Kerryn often organized community events, baked for church functions, and served as a mentor to younger members. She was viewed by many as the embodiment of kindness, a woman who put others before herself. But despite her outward appearance of perfection, there were moments when the weight of life's pressures began to show. Kerryn wasn't immune to challenges. Like many women, she had moments of self-doubt and feelings of being overwhelmed by the responsibilities of motherhood and her other roles. But Kerryn never let those moments define her. Instead, she faced them head-on, determined to always give her best. Though she struggled like anyone else, Kerryn never let those struggles define her. To her friends and family, she was a beacon of positivity and resilience. She was the person they turned to for advice, guidance, and a good laugh. When she was with others, there was a warmth and calmness that radiated from her, a feeling that everything would be okay. Kerryn was the glue that held not only her family together, but also her extended community. She was someone who always knew what to say, how to comfort, and how to make people feel better. However, not everything was perfect behind the scenes. Kerryn's marriage to Greg, while strong on the outside, had its fair share of challenges. While they appeared to be a happy couple, there were moments of tension, misunderstandings, and disagreements. Those who were close to the couple noticed that their relationship wasn't as flawless as it appeared. Kerryn and Greg had experienced financial struggles in the past, and while they managed to work through them, the stress sometimes took a toll on their relationship. Kerryn, for all her strength, had her own insecurities, which sometimes caused friction between the two. Yet, despite these occasional difficulties, Kerryn and Greg remained committed to one another. They had built a strong foundation based on trust and mutual respect. For Kerryn, her family was everything, and she would do anything to protect it. Her bond with her children was something special. She would often spend hours at the kitchen table, helping them with their homework or taking them to sports games. Kerryn was the type of mother who would make sure that her kids knew the importance of kindness, hard work, and the value of giving back to the community. Despite all the love and support around her, Kerryn's life was not without its shadows. As much as she gave to others, there were parts of her own life that she kept hidden. There were secrets, small things she kept to herself, things she didn't always share even with Greg. Her friends noticed her occasionally withdrawing from social activities or having moments of quiet contemplation. Those who were closest to her assumed it was just stress or the demands of motherhood, but no one ever really knew the full extent of what Kerryn was going through. Nevertheless, Kerryn was a woman of great strength and resilience, and her love for her family and her community never wavered. She was someone who made an impact wherever she went, leaving behind a legacy of kindness, service, and a deep love for her family. To those who knew her best, Kerryn Tate was the person they trusted most. Her unexpected death left an unfillable void, one that would affect everyone who had ever crossed paths with her. The night of the crime. It was an ordinary night, or at least it seemed so to those who lived in the small, peaceful town of New Zealand. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and there was a calmness that blanketed the area, making it feel like nothing could possibly disturb the tranquility. But in the quiet hours of the early morning, a tragedy was unfolding in one of the suburban homes. A tragedy that would forever change the lives of the Tate family and the entire community. Around 4:30 a.m., the first signs that something was wrong emerged. A neighbor, living a few houses down from the Tate residence, woke to the sound of something unusual. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, but then the sounds became more distinct, a muffled scream followed by a loud crash. The neighbor, who had been half asleep, couldn't make out exactly what was happening, but it was enough to send a chill down their spine. Something was off. The noise didn't sound like anything they'd heard before. There was an unsettling tension in the air that hadn't been there earlier in the evening. The neighbor debated whether to investigate or to call the police. Unsure of what to do, they decided to dial the local authorities. The call was placed around 4:45 a.m., and by then, the sounds from the Tate household had ceased. The dispatcher on the other end of the line reassured the neighbor, telling them that the police would send someone to check the area. As the minutes ticked by, the sense of dread continued to grow. What had just happened at the Tate house? Was it a break-in? Was Kerryn Tate in trouble? Meanwhile, in the quiet of the Tate home, a scene of horror was unfolding. Kerryn Tate, the beloved mother, wife, and community figure, was in her bedroom, lifeless. Blood had pooled around her, and the room was a chaotic mess. Furniture overturned, drawers pulled out, and items scattered across the floor. But despite the disarray, there were no signs of forced entry. The windows were locked, the doors intact. There was no sign of a struggle, no clear indication of what had led to this brutal act. The police arrived at the scene shortly after receiving the call. They found the front door ajar, and as they entered the house, they immediately saw the disarray within. The officers made their way to the bedroom, where Kerryn's body lay, still and cold. They could see the immediate signs of a violent crime, but as they inspected the scene further, they were met with a strange realization. Nothing had been stolen. No valuables were missing, and there were no signs of a typical break-in. The crime didn't make sense. At first glance, the house appeared to have been disturbed in a way that suggested a robbery, but the lack of missing items made that theory unlikely. If it had been a robbery gone wrong, the perpetrator would have taken something, anything of value. Yet, everything in the house was left untouched. The detectives could feel the confusion mounting. This wasn't the work of an ordinary criminal. What could the motive have been? The first question that arose was about the family, specifically Greg Tate, Kerryn's husband. Where was he? Had he been in the house during the time of the murder? Greg was nowhere to be found when the police arrived, but his car was parked outside the house. The officers quickly learned that he had left for work earlier that morning, and that Kerryn was alone in the house at the time of the attack. It seemed to be a case of a lone perpetrator targeting Kerryn, but without any clear evidence of who could be responsible. For the moment, Greg was ruled out as a suspect. His alibi checked out, and there were no signs of foul play associated with him. Still, his absence from the scene was unsettling. Why had he not been there when the police arrived? Where had he gone in the early hours of the morning? Was there something more to his disappearance that the authorities were overlooking? The police quickly realized that they would need to widen their investigation. They began to speak to neighbors, friends, and anyone who might have known Kerryn well. The goal was to understand what could have led to this horrific event. But with each passing hour, the case only grew more perplexing. As the sun began to rise over the town, the authorities started piecing together the timeline of events. The calls to the dispatcher and the arrival of the officers had all been timely, but the real breakthrough came when a local resident reported something strange. A car had been parked down the street the previous evening, and although no one had noticed anything immediately, the car had been seen driving away just before the first police arrived on the scene. It was a white sedan with tinted windows, but the person driving it had been wearing a hat, obscuring their face. The car had driven away at high speed, and no one could remember seeing it earlier that evening. The presence of the car became a focal point for the investigation. It wasn't much, but it was something, a potential lead, even if it was vague. The detectives had their first clue, and they were determined to follow it. They began canvassing the neighborhood, speaking to residents who may have seen or heard anything that could help identify the mysterious vehicle. But the leads were still thin, and time was slipping away. Inside the house, the crime scene was meticulously examined. While there were no signs of forced entry, the investigators began to suspect that the perpetrator might have been someone Kerryn knew, someone who had access to the house and who didn't need to break in. But who could that be? Who would have a motive to kill Kerryn Tate, and why? The detectives went through her personal belongings, checking her phone records, emails, and social media activity, hoping to find any sign of a connection to the crime. The hours passed, And as the investigation continued, the pieces of the puzzle started to fit together, slowly. A few hours later, the forensic team identified a small but important detail, a single, unfamiliar set of footprints outside the back door. They had been overlooked at first, but upon closer inspection, it became clear that someone had entered through the rear of the house. The footprint was larger than normal, possibly indicating that the person was male. The discovery added another layer of mystery. If the killer had entered through the back door, why hadn't anyone heard anything? Had the person been inside the house for a long time, or had they left shortly after the murder? The detectives' instincts told them that this case wasn't going to be solved quickly. There were too many questions and too few answers. As the day wore on, the authorities realized that they were facing a crime unlike anything they had ever dealt with. This was no ordinary murder. Whoever had committed this crime had done so with a level of precision and planning that was unsettling. It was clear that the killer had known the victim, that they had known how to get in without raising alarms, and that they had a reason for taking Kerryn's life. But what was that reason? The investigation was far from over. With each new discovery, the mystery deepened, and the hunt for the killer intensified. But the question still lingered. Who killed Kerryn Tate, and why? Early leads. The investigation into Kerryn Tate's death moved swiftly into its first critical phase, as the police worked tirelessly to gather evidence and piece together the details of the crime. Every step taken seemed to open new questions rather than answers. It became apparent early on that this wasn't just a random act of violence. The details suggested that Kerryn was targeted by someone who knew her. But the question remained, who could have done this, and why? The first lead that seemed promising came from a conversation Kerryn had with a close friend just days before her death. The friend recalled that Kerryn had mentioned an argument with a family member, something that had been brewing for a while. Kerryn, typically a private person, had confided in her friend that the argument had escalated recently, and that it had left her feeling betrayed. The family member, whom Kerryn refused to name, had been a source of stress in her life. This conversation planted a seed of suspicion, and the detectives quickly turned their focus to Kerryn's relatives. But there was no clear explanation for the conflict. Kerryn had never mentioned any specific details or motives, leaving the police with more questions than answers. Was the argument significant enough to lead to a murder? And if so, who was this family member, and why would they want to harm Kerryn? The investigation turned to Kerryn's husband, Greg Tate, who had been one of the first to arrive at the scene. He was understandably devastated by the loss of his wife and remained calm and cooperative with the police, providing them with the details of his whereabouts on the night of the murder. Greg had left the house early for work, arriving at his job as usual. His alibi was corroborated by his employer and co-workers, who confirmed his presence at the office. But the detectives couldn't let go of the fact that Greg had seemed distant when he was first questioned. While it was clear that he was grieving, his lack of emotion raised some eyebrows. Could he have been involved in the crime? The detectives scrutinized every aspect of Greg's background, from his financial records to any past disputes with Kerryn. But there was nothing that suggested he was capable of committing such a brutal act. With no clear evidence pointing to Greg, the detectives turned to Kerryn's social circle. They began by speaking with her close friends, trying to uncover any details that might explain why someone would want to harm her. One of her friends mentioned an acquaintance from the past, a man named James, who had been a former close friend of Kerryn's but had mysteriously disappeared years ago. James had been part of a group of friends that Kerryn had been very close to in her early 20s. However, a falling out with Kerryn had pushed him out of her life, and no one had heard from him since. What made James particularly intriguing was that, according to Kerryn's friend, James had a history of volatile behavior. He had been known to have a temper, and rumors suggested that he had been infatuated with Kerryn at one point. Could James have resurfaced in Kerryn's life, and if so, could he have been the one responsible for her murder? The detectives needed to track him down to find out. The police dug into James's history, trying to locate him. His last known address was a few towns away, but when they arrived, they were met with a dead end. James hadn't lived there in years, and there was no trace of him at his previous workplace. But the detectives weren't ready to let go of the lead. They began to interview people who might have known him during his disappearance, hoping to get any hint of his whereabouts. Meanwhile, the investigation into the circumstances surrounding Kerryn's life continued. It was discovered that she had been spending more time on social media in the weeks leading up to her death. She had recently reconnected with several old acquaintances, including James. Detectives were able to find a series of messages exchanged between Kerryn and James just days before her murder. The tone of the messages seemed harmless enough, but there was a palpable tension between the two. The conversation had turned awkward after Kerryn asked James to stop contacting her, suggesting that their past relationship had caused some discomfort. The messages revealed that James had asked to meet up with Kerryn, but she had firmly declined. Kerryn had stated that she was happily married and that she wanted to put their past behind her. But James had persisted, trying to convince her that they could remain friends. It was clear that Kerryn had been uncomfortable with the situation, which only made the detectives more suspicious. Could James's obsession with Kerryn have escalated into violence? As the detectives followed the trail, they discovered that James had been in the area at the time of the murder. The night Kerryn was killed, a witness reported seeing a white sedan parked near the Tate residence. The car had been seen driving away shortly after the police arrived, and the witness had noted that the driver had a hat on, obscuring their face. The vehicle matched the description of James's car, a fact that didn't go unnoticed by the investigators. James was eventually located at a small apartment in another town, and the police wasted no time in bringing him in for questioning. When he was confronted, James initially denied any involvement in the murder of Kerryn Tate. He claimed he had no idea why the police were interested in him, and that he had been living a quiet life, far from his past mistakes. But as the questioning continued, inconsistencies began to surface. James's alibi for the night of the murder didn't add up, and his behavior became more erratic. He claimed that he had been at a bar during the time of Kerryn's death, but no one at the bar could verify his presence. The detectives were now convinced that James was hiding something. His past with Kerryn, the strange messages, the car seen near her house, and his inability to provide a clear alibi all pointed to one conclusion. James was connected to the murder. But was he the killer? Or had he been involved in some other way? The investigation didn't stop with James. The detectives continued to follow up on other leads, including the possibility of a financial motive. Kerryn had been in charge of her family's finances and had managed a significant amount of money for various community events. Was there a connection between the murder and her financial dealings? However, after a thorough search of Kerryn's records, no irregularities were found. Her financial situation appeared stable, with no signs of fraud, embezzlement, or financial struggle. Despite the dead ends, the detectives remained determined. Every new lead brought them closer to the truth, but they were still left with too many questions. As the investigation continued to unfold, one thing became clear. The murder of Kerryn Tate was no ordinary crime. There were too many layers, too many motives, and too many people with secrets. It wasn't going to be easy to uncover the truth, but the police were prepared to keep digging, no matter where the trail led. Red herrings. The investigation into Kerryn Tate's murder had entered a phase of increasing confusion, with the primary suspect, James, appearing more and more likely to be involved. A series of unexpected leads caused the detectives to question their assumptions. What seemed like clear connections began to fray at the edges, and the closer they got to the truth, the more elusive it became. It felt like the investigation was on a never-ending merry-go-round, with every new clue sending them in the wrong direction. One of the earliest red herrings to emerge was the involvement of an unknown man seen near the Tate residence. A neighbor had reported seeing a man walking down the street the evening before Kerryn's murder. The man, described as tall and wearing a dark jacket, had been lurking near the house, looking as though he was waiting for something. The witness couldn't say for sure if the man had entered the property, but they had seen him looking around in an odd manner. This suspicious sighting led the police to suspect that the killer might be someone completely unrelated to the Tate family, a stranger who had simply targeted Kerryn. The police quickly began searching for the mysterious man, but when they asked the neighbors, no one could provide a detailed description of his face. The vague nature of the witness statement made it nearly impossible to track down the individual. Investigators looked into the possibility of an opportunistic criminal, someone who might have been watching the neighborhood in search of a victim. They checked local criminal records and canvassed nearby streets, but every lead turned out to be a dead end. It was starting to seem like the mysterious man was just an apparition, someone the witness had seen in a moment of confusion. As the investigation continued, another strange lead emerged that seemed to complicate things further. Police received an anonymous tip about a potential financial motive behind the murder. Kerryn had been managing the funds for a series of local charity events, and the tip suggested that there might have been financial discrepancies in her bookkeeping. The anonymous caller claimed that Kerryn had been embezzling funds and that someone who had discovered this was responsible for her murder. The detectives were initially shocked by the possibility of Kerryn being involved in criminal activity, but they followed the lead nonetheless. The investigators spent several days combing through Kerryn's financial records. They meticulously checked every transaction, every receipt, and every bank statement, hoping to uncover something that might suggest she was involved in wrongdoing. But after thorough analysis, they found no evidence of financial mismanagement or embezzlement. In fact, Kerryn's finances appeared to be in order, and all charity events had been properly documented. The anonymous tip turned out to be a false lead, another red herring meant to misdirect the police into chasing a wild goose. In addition to the financial tip, rumors began to circulate about Kerryn's supposed secret lover. Some of her friends mentioned in passing that Kerryn had been spending a lot of time with a man from a different town, someone she had known from her youth. The friend described the relationship as complicated and suggested that Kerryn might have been involved in a clandestine affair. The possibility of infidelity added another layer of complexity to the investigation. Could this man have been a jealous lover, angry at Kerryn for ending the relationship? The detectives followed up on this lead by tracking down the man in question. When they found him, he was more than willing to cooperate. He confirmed that he had known Kerryn years ago, but that their contact had been purely platonic. They had exchanged occasional messages, but there had never been anything romantic between them. His alibi for the night of the murder checked out, and there was no evidence to suggest that he had been in town recently. The theory of a secret affair crumbled under scrutiny, and the detectives were left with no further information on the matter. Once again, they had followed a lead that led nowhere. Just when it seemed like the investigation couldn't become more convoluted, another lead surfaced. This time, it came from a completely unexpected source, Kerryn's own daughter, who had mentioned a strange encounter she'd had the night before her mother's death. According to the young girl, she had seen a car parked outside their house late at night, with a man sitting inside, staring at the house. The child claimed that she had thought nothing of it at the time, but in the wake of her mother's murder, the memory had resurfaced. The man in the car hadn't been anyone she recognized, and the sighting sent the investigators back to square one. The detectives considered the possibility that the man in the car could be another suspicious figure, but when they canvassed the area, they were unable to find any further witnesses. It was unclear whether the man had been lingering near the house for any particular reason, or whether it was just a coincidence. The timing of the sighting, just hours before the murder, made the incident seem important, but without further evidence, it was yet another false lead. It felt like the investigation was being clouded by an endless series of false sightings and hearsay. As the days passed, the detectives found themselves juggling multiple red herrings, all of which seemed to pull them in different directions. The case was growing increasingly frustrating, as the new leads only made it harder to uncover the truth. Every potential lead seemed promising at first, but each time the detectives dug deeper, they encountered more confusion and misdirection. One of the most perplexing red herrings involved the Tate family's neighbors. Several of them claimed to have seen a strange woman in the neighborhood the day before the murder. The woman had been described as disheveled and seemed to be acting strangely, wandering around the street for hours. One neighbor even swore that she had seen the woman talking to Kerryn at the front door. The detectives were initially intrigued by the possibility that this woman might be involved, but when they tracked her down, they discovered that she was simply a local who had been walking her dog. The woman had no connection to the case whatsoever, and her presence in the neighborhood had been nothing more than a coincidence. The accumulation of these dead ends left the detectives feeling more uncertain than ever. The case, once thought to be straightforward, was now filled with more questions than answers. Every time they thought they had uncovered a clue, it slipped through their fingers, leading them in the wrong direction. The red herrings had piled up, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish the real evidence from the distractions. Despite these frustrations, the detectives knew that they couldn't give up. The key to solving the murder of Kerryn Tate lay somewhere in the tangled web of leads and misdirection. It would take time, but eventually, the truth would come to light. Weeks had passed since Kerryn Tate's murder, and the investigation seemed to be at a standstill. The detectives were frustrated, having followed countless false leads and red herrings, each one more misleading than the last. Yet despite the numerous setbacks, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something critical, something small, yet crucial, that could turn the case around. Just as hope was beginning to fade, the breakthrough they had been waiting for finally arrived. It came in the form of a piece of evidence that had been overlooked, buried in the noise of 100 other distractions. It all started with a small piece of overlooked security footage. Detectives had previously reviewed footage from several nearby security cameras, but they had failed to spot anything significant at the time. However, during a routine review of the footage, a rookie officer stumbled upon something strange. A white sedan, identified earlier as being potentially connected to the case, was seen on a different camera further down the street, parked near a convenience store. This wasn't just any car. This was the same car that had been seen near the Tate residence on the night of the murder. What caught the officer's attention wasn't the car itself, but the figure that got out of it. The figure in the footage appeared to be a man, dressed in dark clothing. He was tall, with a broad build, and his movements were deliberate, almost as though he was trying to avoid being seen. The officer quickly ran the video through facial recognition software, but it didn't yield any immediate results. However, upon closer inspection, the man was seen speaking to the store clerk, asking for directions to a street near the Tate home. The clerk remembered the encounter, as the man seemed unfamiliar with the area and appeared to be lost. This seemingly trivial detail would later prove to be a crucial piece of the puzzle. The car was traced back to a man named Peter Clarkson, a local resident with no prior criminal record. Peter had lived in the town for years, and while he wasn't well known, he had a history of being a quiet, solitary individual. When the detectives dug deeper into his life, they learned that Peter had been an acquaintance of Greg Tate, Kerryn's husband, from many years ago. The two men had met while working together at a local factory, but their paths had diverged over the years. Kerryn had mentioned Peter in passing to her friends, describing him as a quiet man who kept to himself. It seemed like an innocuous detail at the time, but now, it was a lead that needed further investigation. Peter Clarkson's connection to the Tate family was enough to raise suspicion. The detectives paid him a visit, hoping to get a sense of whether he was involved in Kerryn's murder. When Peter was questioned, he seemed calm and cooperative, denying any involvement in the crime. He claimed that he had been at home on the night of the murder, but when the detectives pressed him, they discovered that his alibi was weak. No one could confirm his whereabouts, and Peter seemed unusually nervous when discussing the events of that night. The police were determined to get to the bottom of this. They combed through Peter's personal life, searching for any evidence that might connect him to Kerryn. They discovered that Peter had, in fact, been in contact with Kerryn in the months leading up to her death. It wasn't anything overtly suspicious, just a few emails and phone calls exchanged between the two. The contents of the conversations were innocuous, with Peter asking Kerryn for advice on personal matters. But the fact that Peter had reached out to Kerryn at all raised further questions. It wasn't until the detectives examined Peter's financial records that the breakthrough they had been waiting for finally emerged. Peter had been under financial strain for some time, something he had not revealed during his initial questioning. He had a significant amount of debt and was in danger of losing his home. When the detectives reviewed his recent transactions, they discovered a troubling pattern. Peter had been sending large sums of money to an unknown account, one that appeared to be linked to a gambling ring. The amount of money involved was substantial, and it seemed clear that Peter was in over his head. His debts were mounting, and he was desperate for a way out. Peter's financial troubles, combined with his previous interactions with Kerryn, began to paint a disturbing picture. Could Peter have murdered Kerryn to cover up his financial problems? The possibility seemed more and more likely as the detectives delved deeper into his past. They learned that Peter had been on the fringes of the local gambling scene for years, and that his recent losses had driven him to the edge. The detectives continued to follow the evidence, hoping to uncover more information about Peter's connection to Kerryn. They interviewed his friends and associates, and while no one could confirm any direct threat or conflict between Peter and Kerryn, they learned that Peter had a history of impulsive behavior. He had been known to lash out when he felt cornered or desperate. A pattern began to form. Peter, financially desperate and emotionally unstable, had used his connection to Kerryn as a way to try and escape his mounting problems. The turning point came when the police received a tip from a local pawn shop. A man, later identified as Peter Clarkson, had sold several high-value items in the days following Kerryn's murder. The items were of personal value to Kerryn, including a necklace that had belonged to her mother. The pawn shop's records confirmed that Peter had been the one to bring in the items, and the detectives now had concrete evidence linking him to the crime. Peter Clarkson was arrested and brought in for questioning. This time, the detectives had him cornered. Faced with the overwhelming evidence, his connection to Kerryn, his financial troubles, and the pawned items, Peter broke down. He admitted to murdering Kerryn, though his motivations were less clear than anyone had expected. Peter claimed that he had not intended to kill her, but that in the heat of an argument over money, things had escalated. Kerryn had rejected his plea for help, and in his desperation, Peter had resorted to violence. He explained that he had gone to Kerryn's house on the night of the murder, hoping to ask her for a loan to cover his gambling debts. But when she refused, and when she began to threaten him with exposing his financial troubles, Peter lost control. He had never planned on killing her, but in the heat of the moment, the situation spiraled out of control. Kerryn had struggled, and in his panic, Peter had struck her. Peter Clarkson's confession brought the investigation to a close, but it left a sense of unease among the detectives. The case, which had seemed so straightforward in the beginning, had turned out to be far more complicated. Peter's motives had been driven by desperation and a series of bad choices, but the investigation had uncovered much more than just a simple crime of passion. It had revealed the tangled web of human emotions, financial ruin, and the dangerous consequences of losing control. With the confession in hand and the case solved, the detectives could finally bring some closure to Kerryn's family. But the impact of the crime would linger long after the investigation ended. The story of Kerryn Tate's murder was not just about one man's desperation. It was a tragic reminder of how far someone could go when pushed to the brink. The moment of reckoning had arrived. After weeks of painstaking investigation, countless leads, and numerous false turns, the detectives finally had Peter Clarkson cornered. The room was thick with tension as the suspect sat in front of them, his body language betraying his fear and guilt. Peter's eyes darted nervously around the room, but he knew that the truth was out. There was no way to escape now. The mounting evidence, the security footage, the pawned items, the financial records, had left him with no room to maneuver. It was only a matter of time before he would have to confess. The detective leaned forward, his voice steady but firm, as he asked Peter one final question. "Why did you kill Kerryn Tate?" Peter's lip trembled as he tried to compose himself. For a moment, he remained silent, but then, with a deep sigh, he began to speak. The words tumbled out in a rush, fueled by a mixture of remorse and desperation. He explained how he had been drowning in debt, unable to keep up with the gambling losses that had plagued him for months. In his mind, Kerryn had been his last hope, a way out of his financial nightmare. But when she had rejected him, and when she had threatened to expose his struggles, something inside him snapped. Peter's confession was chilling. He admitted that he had gone to Kerryn's house that night, hoping for a loan to cover his debts. But when Kerryn had turned him down, and when she had demanded that he leave her property, Peter's anger had overtaken him. He had struck her in a moment of rage, and as she tried to fight him off, he had become even more violent. He had never intended to kill her, but the struggle had escalated out of control, and in the end, Kerryn lay dead at his feet. Peter's remorse was evident, but it did nothing to undo the damage he had caused. As Peter finished his confession, the room fell into an eerie silence. The detectives exchanged glances, each of them processing the devastating truth. They had solved the case, but the revelation left them with a lingering sense of sadness. Peter Clarkson had been a man driven by desperation, and in his attempt to escape his problems, he had caused irreparable harm. The detectives knew that no matter how hard they tried, they would never be able to fully erase the tragedy that had unfolded in the quiet suburban town. Kerryn Tate's life had been taken, and for her family and friends, the pain would never truly go away. Peter Clarkson's confession brought an end to the official investigation into Kerryn Tate's murder, but for those who knew her, it was hard to shake the sense of unresolved mystery that lingered in the air. The case was closed, and Peter was taken into custody, but justice didn't feel complete. The fact that he had killed Kerryn out of sheer desperation, driven by his mounting financial troubles, left everyone questioning how things could have gone so wrong. Could anything have been done to prevent this tragic outcome? Was there more to Peter's story that had never been uncovered? While Peter's confession brought closure in a legal sense, it did little to ease the emotional pain felt by Kerryn's family and friends. Greg Tate, her husband, was left with a broken heart and the impossible task of explaining to his children why their mother had been taken from them. His life, once filled with warmth and stability, had been torn apart by the violent death of his wife. The realization that Kerryn's killer had been someone from their own past, a man they had trusted, only deepened the wound. It wasn't just the loss of her life that hurt. It was the betrayal, the senselessness of it all. For Kerryn's friends and community, the closure brought by Peter's confession felt hollow. While they had hoped for justice, the emotional scars would remain for a long time. Kerryn had been a beloved figure, someone who had given so much to her family and community. To know that her life had been taken in such a brutal and senseless way left many grappling with the larger questions about the fragility of life and the unpredictability of human behavior. How could a man who had seemed so harmless, a former friend, end up causing such devastation? The community came together in the wake of Kerryn's death, but it wasn't the same. People who had once been close now found it difficult to move forward. While the killer had been caught, a deep sense of unease remained. The events of that night, the violence that had erupted without warning, made everyone question how well they really knew the people around them. Peter's confession had answered the question of who, but it didn't provide the answers to the deeper questions that everyone still struggled with. As Peter Clarkson was led away to face his trial, the town struggled to heal. For the Tate family, no amount of justice could bring Kerryn back. The grief was overwhelming, and the emotional toll on Greg and the children would last a lifetime. There would be no easy answers, no simple solutions. In the end, while justice had been served in a legal sense, the emotional and psychological impact of Kerryn's murder remained. The questions of why and how would linger forever, leaving a deep void in the hearts of those who loved her.